on the internet, and whom I met at the fair conference, a very nice guy. He is very interested in this Council of the Gods, and in fact I believe he's making this his PhD work. And I have also been quite interested in this simply because it so electrified the Christians of Joseph Smith's day. Joseph Smith announced this Council of the Gods idea, and of course his translation of the Book of Abraham, chapter 3, discusses this Council of the Gods. And it was such an astonishingly new view, a new doctrine, in the 1830s and 40s that people couldn't hardly grasp it. They couldn't wrap their minds around it. And now it's just almost on every biblical scholar's tongue. It's almost a foregone conclusion. Joseph Smith was way ahead of his time on this subject. I want to explore what Jim Adams argues against the LDS theological stance of the Council of the Gods, and I've looked into his footnotes, and I've gathered several of the references that Jim has gathered, and I completely disagree with his use of those sources. I don't think he is accurately portraying the scholars' views at all on this Council of the Gods, so that's what I'm going to discuss. He begins by saying Judaism and Christianity have historically affirmed and insisted that there is but one true and living God. He is not embodied, he is not a material being, and he transcends the cosmos. He says this on page 153. Well, historically affirmed depends on how far back you go into history. There's new research showing the exact opposite. So right there, his article is problematic. It depends on how far back you go into history, because that's not true in the ancient Hebraic priesthood historical surveys that have been coming out now with Mark S. Smith, whom Adams uses, and Margaret Barker, whom he should have used but didn't, and several other scholars. He discusses the ancient Near Eastern backdrop of the Old Testament, and here he emphasizes, in a correct way, that the ancient Israelites did not live in a cultural vacuum isolated from their neighbors. To the contrary, the pages of the Old Testament are clearly saturated in Israel's cultural environment, the laws, the literary genres, etc. Nor were the writers of the Old Testament completely unaware of the pagan views of God and the world that were commonly held in the ancient Near East. And this is absolutely fundamentally true. Jim is right on the spot here. And he discusses the Canaanite culture is obviously an important part of the backdrop of the Old Testament. This is on page 155. And it is debated how far an actual cosmogony of the Canaanites goes, and so on and so forth. That's true, but the point is the Canaanite influence is very powerful. And this has been archaeologically confirmed absolutely all over the place. And then Adams does a very interesting thing in his research here. And I want you to pay attention to this subtlety. He discusses the Egyptian and Mesopotamian cosmologies, and he goes through the primordial waters and matter and the theogonies and so on and so forth, and magic, and he discusses the role of humanity with creation and so on and so forth. He emphasizes the Egyptian and Mesopotamian cosmogonies, but he doesn't discuss the Canaanite materials. The sleight of hand is the greatest influence on ancient Israel were the Canaanites. But he minimizes that, and he overemphasizes the other two cultures, Egyptian and Mesopotamian, among others. Those aren't the only exclusive influences of Israel by any means, but so he emphasizes the lesser, and he de-emphasizes the greater. And I believe the reason is obvious why, as I'll show you. Then he goes into the Old Testament view of God and creation. God is the maker of heaven and earth, and he quotes several chapters and scriptures there and about the laws of creation and so on and so forth. Well, his whole point, and this I believe is one of the fundamental flaws of Jim Adams' research. He already has the answer, and now he's fitting the data to his already preconceived answer, because of course he accepts classical Christianity definitions, understandings, and views based on post-Christ day time. His is strictly a Christian understanding that developed after the various councils of the church had already canonized the scriptures post 300 AD and on. He says God has no theogony or pantheon. This is absolutely false. And here's where he uses sources to fit his preconceived notions, and he only uses part of the sources of Mark Smith and of several, Frank Moore-Cross and several other scholars. He doesn't give their fullest conclusions, nor their full reasonings of the historical and archaeological data that they have accumulated to come to the picture of demonstrating powerfully that ancient Israel was polytheistic. Not in the sense of worshiping many gods, but understanding that there were many gods, but to them they worshipped the one God. But that did not eliminate the existence of others, not by any chance. He says, unlike the gods of the nations, the God of the Old Testament has no nativity, no parents, and no offspring. He has no genealogy, and he does not die. The Old Testament assumes from beginning to end that God has always existed, and has always existed as God. And here is another very interesting sleight of hand. He's going by today's current conception of the Old Testament. Margaret Barker, in her many books, The Great Angel, The Great High Priest, in her analysis of the book of Enoch, in her revelation of Jesus Christ, in her book, The Older Testament, several books now, she's been showing how the Old Testament as we currently have it, yes, describes a certain way of being, a certain style of theology, but this is basically a rewrite job. It's not the Older Testament. The Older Testament was First Temple Judaism religion of the ability of humankind to ascend to heaven, to have visions of God, to see God, and to actually become deified. It was a world of angelic visitors, much like Joseph Smith's world. So he is not giving the fullest picture here that is available archaeologically, nor historically, nor theologically. It is also significant, he says on page 171, that the Old Testament gives no indication that God is merely the high God of a pantheon, as was so common in the ancient Near Eastern religion. And yet El Elyon in the Hebrew means the Most High God, the God of the gods, which he does not analyze, not at all. But his idea is the Old Testament of today doesn't give that indication, but of course not, because that has been eliminated. And Margaret Barker makes a powerful case. And interestingly, so does Mark S. Smith. Now, he uses Mark S. Smith way back here in his footnotes. I'm on page 446. He says, in footnote 96, and here's where he uses Mark S. Smith, The Early History of God, and Peter Heyman, and some of the others. No Margaret Barker here, though, that I see. That's too bad. She's so good. Anyway, there is no possibility that Yahweh is simply one of the sons of God to whom nations are allocated. This is fundamentally false. And he tries to wiggle around this. The Old Testament name, Elyon, is a typical epithet used for Yahweh. And here he uses Frank Moore-Cross and Mark S. Smith a little bit. And the idea that Mark S. Smith and Mark